One of the more exquisite ironies of our political moment, and there are many competing for that distinction, is the spectacle of watching self-proclaimed progressives contort themselves into positions that would make a medieval theologian blush. Here we have it. The inheritors of the Enlightenment, the supposed guardians of secular values and universal human rights, have managed to transform themselves into the most reliable apologists for theocratic absolutism. And in doing so, they have performed that most unforgivable of political acts. They have handed their best arguments to their worst enemies. Consider, if you will, the grotesque pas de deux that now passes for progressive discourse on the subject of Islamic orthodoxy. A gay rights activist who would chain themselves to the gates of a Baptist church for refusing to bake a wedding cake will, in the next breath, explain why we must respect and understand a religious ideology that prescribes death for homosexuality. A feminist who can detect patriarchal oppression in the way a man sits on public transport will suddenly discover nuance and cultural context when confronted with the mandatory veiling of women. The same voices that, quite rightly, excoriate Christian fundamentalists for their Bronze Age attitudes toward human sexuality become strangely mute when confronted with the rather more draconian prescriptions of Islamic scripture. This is not merely inconsistent. Inconsistency is, after all, the tribute that mediocrity pays to genius. This is something far worse. It is moral cowardice dressed up as cultural sensitivity, intellectual bankruptcy masquerading as sophistication. And it represents nothing less than a comprehensive betrayal of every principle that the left once claimed to hold sacred. The roots of this capitulation are not difficult to discern. Part of it certainly stems from a laudable impulse, the desire to protect a minority community from genuine bigotry and discrimination. One need not embrace the hysteria of the xenophobic right to acknowledge that Muslims in Western societies often face real prejudice. But somewhere along the line, this protective instinct metastasized into something altogether different, a wholesale inability to distinguish between criticism of ideas and persecution of people. The result is a kind of soft bigotry of lowered expectations, whereby brown-skinned people are apparently incapable of being held to the same standards of rational discourse and moral accountability as everyone else. There is, too, the influence of that most pernicious of academic infections, the notion that all cultures are equally valid, that moral relativism is a mark of sophistication, and that to suggest otherwise is to commit the unpardonable sin of cultural imperialism. Never mind that the very concept of universal human rights, which these same academics claim to champion, is meaningless without the acknowledgement that some cultural practices are simply incompatible with human dignity. Never mind that the women being stoned to death for adultery, the homosexuals being thrown from rooftops, the apostates being executed for thought crimes, might have a rather different view of cultural relativism than their tenured defenders in Western universities. But perhaps the most contemptible aspect of this surrender is the way it has abandoned the very people within Muslim communities who most desperately need support: the reformers, the secularists, the feminists, the gay rights activists who risk their lives daily to challenge theocratic oppression. These brave souls, who face death threats and exile for expressing the mildest criticism of religious orthodoxy, must watch in bewilderment as their supposed allies in the West bend over backwards to excuse and rationalize the very forces that seek to silence them. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Maajid Nawaz, Sarah Haider, these voices crying out for reform are not merely ignored, but actively vilified by a left that prefers the comfortable certainties of victimhood narratives to the messy complexities of genuine solidarity. And so we arrive at our present absurdity, a political landscape in which the only voices willing to state the obvious about theocratic absolutism come from the fever swamps of the populist right. When Marine Le Pen becomes the defender of secular values, when Viktor Orbán positions himself as the champion of women's rights, when the only politicians willing to discuss the incompatibility of Sharia law with democratic principles are those whose other views range from merely repugnant to actively fascistic, then something has gone catastrophically wrong with our political discourse. This is not, let me be absolutely clear, an endorsement of these political charlatans. Their criticism of Islamic extremism is as opportunistic as it is selective. They care nothing for human rights when it doesn't serve their nativist agenda. and their proposed solutions invariably involve the kind of collective punishment and ethnic discrimination that would make their criticism a self-fulfilling prophecy. But their bad faith does not make the questions they raise any less valid, nor does it excuse the left's abdication of responsibility in addressing them. The tragedy here is that there exists a perfectly coherent progressive position on this issue, one that manages to defend the rights of Muslim citizens while maintaining an uncompromising critique of religious extremism. It is possible to oppose both the bigotry of the anti-Muslim right and the bigotry of Islamic fundamentalism. It is possible to defend the right of Muslims to practice their faith while condemning practices that violate human dignity. It is possible to acknowledge the role of Western foreign policy in creating conditions for extremism while still holding extremists responsible for their actions. These are not contradictions. They are the basic requirements of moral consistency. But such a position requires something that seems to be in increasingly short supply: intellectual courage. It requires the willingness to be called an Islamophobe by the bien-pensant left and a terrorist sympathizer by the populist right. It requires the ability to hold multiple ideas in one's head simultaneously, without one's brain melting from cognitive dissonance. Most importantly, it requires a commitment to universal principles that transcends tribal loyalties and political convenience. The consequences of this failure extend far beyond abstract philosophical debates. When the left cedes the ground of secular criticism to the right, it doesn't just lose an argument, it loses elections. Working-class voters who see their daughters harassed for wearing skirts in neighborhoods that have become de facto theocracies, who watch as hard-won rights are eroded in the name of religious accommodation, who are told that their concerns about parallel legal systems and honor killings are merely manifestations of racism. These voters will not simply accept their assigned role as bigots. They will vote for whoever promises to address their concerns, however dishonestly, however crudely, however dangerously. Moreover, this capitulation represents a profound historical amnesia. The left once understood that religion, all religion, was a tool of oppression, a means by which the powerful maintained their dominance over the powerless. Religion is the opium of the people, as a certain bearded German once observed, and this insight did not come with an asterisk exempting religions practiced by ethnic minorities. The great battles for secular democracy, for women's rights, for sexual liberation, for freedom of expression, all were fought against religious orthodoxy. To abandon this legacy now, at the very moment when theocratic forces are resurgent globally, is not merely foolish, it is suicidal. What is needed now is a recovery of nerve, a rediscovery of the moral clarity that once animated progressive politics. This means stating plainly that a religion that prescribes death for apostasy is incompatible with freedom of conscience. It means acknowledging that a legal system that values a woman's testimony as worth half that of a man's is incompatible with gender equality. It means recognizing that an ideology that condemns homosexuality as an abomination is incompatible with human dignity, and it means doing so without apology, without equivocation, and without the endless qualifications and contextualizations that serve only to muddy waters that should be crystal clear. This is not a call for discrimination or persecution. It is a call for consistency. The same standards that we apply to Christian fundamentalists, to Jewish ultra-Orthodox, to Hindu nationalists, must be applied equally to Islamic extremists. The same solidarity we extend to women fighting patriarchy in Western societies must be extended to women fighting patriarchy in Muslim societies. The same support we offer to LGBTQ people confronting Christian bigotry must be offered to LGBTQ people confronting Islamic bigotry. Until the left recovers this consistency, until it rediscovers its commitment to universal principles over particular identities, it will continue to hemorrhage both moral authority and political power. And the greatest tragedy of all is that those who will suffer most from this abdication are precisely those the left claims to champion: the marginalized, the oppressed, the voiceless, who need defenders with the courage to defend them against all forms of oppression, regardless of its source, regardless of its garb, regardless of its God.